let's make nothing. And when I say we are not making anything, we're designing a system. We're going to design a system and make it more accessible by using something called as contextual replacement, which is probably not a real word or whatever. I've just come up with it to kind of make my design work easier. And this idea of contextual replacement is basically what we are doing is we're diving into your inherited knowledge, and we're asking the right questions, and we're replacing the context of those questions to make the systems more agency driven and novel in some form. For example, when making a survival game, I imagine the player to ask themselves at the very first introduction is, why am I here? And to answer that question, we need to establish where we are, because I think an established location always holds a resource alongside with it. For example, desert, water. And if we shift that where the location is survival and the resource is surviving, which can sound complicated, I get it, but let's make that easier really quickly. To make this easier, let's establish the cycle of eat. The cycle of eat represents why you eat. You get hungry, you look for food, you find food, you consume food, you digest food, you go back to being hungry. You know this, I know this. But I want you to imagine yourself stripped out of all your inherent information or knowledge and in the same cycle. So, what if you did not know that the process of eating solves hunger? And let's suppose you know that. What if you couldn't differentiate between what's edible and what's inedible? How do you figure this out? What if you couldn't tell what food was by material or texture? How do you find that? How do you, agency? So let's replace the contexts of the same cycle of eat to survival, and you get something in terms of survival, need for survival, resource finding, resource consumption, the process of surviving, and then you go back to the need for survival. And this helps us replace context and answer questions. But this is still not close to anything. All this does is establishes a novel system. This still does not possess any form of agency. Now, to possess or to give this some form of agency driven gameplay or behavior, what we can do is establish some form of resource management and or the resource itself. To do this, it's very simple. Have a volume, have a resource, fill the volume with the resource, done. But going back to the same context and asking ourselves the same question, how do you know that the volume is supposed to hold that resource? To answer that, we go to something called as brinkness. Imagine a water bottle and I strip you of all of your information. How do you know that the water bottle is supposed to hold water? You don't. And I'm trying to think of the water bottle from the perspective of object-oriented ontology, of philosophy, where we are not really thinking about an object by the human function of it, but by the object's mere need to exist. And now, what you do is imagine a cube that holds your resource. How do you communicate to the user that this cube is supposed to hold the resource? And the answer to that is introducing brinkness. So creating references. The past state of the cube holds a little bit of resource, and then the newer state holds none. So you exhaust the resource, show the change in states, and this creates a reference that from the past state to the new state that this cube is supposed to hold the resource dash x, whatever. And if it does not hold the resource x, then this would happen. Let's shift the context back to the ship game. We take fuel as our resource, and we know for a moment that the fuel is required for the ship to run, but we need to communicate this in the game. And I know that as a player you know, but how do you know what's fuel and what's not? So use a progress bar, use diegetic or non-diegetic UI, use a box on the ship, whatever you want, does not matter. Now fill that box up quite very little with fuel. The fuel can be any color, it can be water, no one gives a fuck. Let the fuel exhaust, let the water exhaust. We do not need to narrow down what it is. We don't need to give it a noun. It could be anything. You can always replace the context later. It's the mechanic that needs to exist. Let that thing shrink. Let the ship stop. And let that create a reference saying, oh, this box held something, and when it held something, my ship kept going, and now it doesn't hold that something, and now my ship has stopped. You have just made a agency for someone to fill this box up with the X resource. Good job. We have just designed an agency driven, almost novel solution using pre existing contexts and already existing knowledge, inherited knowledge, and we have made it easily accessible. And now you can focus on the fun generation or the mechanics generation because the meaning behind it exists and it makes sense.